Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Excited to share the Permiso platform to share what we're seeing in the field and how we see the market. We've recently added a lot to the platform that makes us be more of a soup to nuts identity security solution. So excited to share that with you. And let me share my screen here. So I just want to kind of give a baseline of who we are. Um, there we go. And what the problem we're trying to solve is. And then we can get into the demo. So what we're seeing, this is pretty established numbers across the industry. I'm pulling this from IBM's cost of a data breach report. We are also pulling some data from CrowdStrike. Um, and what we're seeing is that the majority of breaches today can be attributed to identity, whether it involves insider threat, stolen credentials, um, all that sort of stuff. Most of the attacks are centered around uh, identity. And then what we're seeing is actually even more surprising is that organizations aren't not doing anything in the identity space. They're doing what they can, and these attacks are still happening within organizations that have existing identity and access management controls in place. So even with current tooling, current processes, the majority of these organizations are still getting popped. And once they're in, they sit there and they sit there for an average of 292 days, which is kind of a crazy stat, almost 300 days they're in organizations. And to give you some perspective about how this compares to endpoint, because I think there's a lot of parallels between the identity space and the endpoint space. This is 30% longer than malware-based breaches. So they're in your environment, pivoting and escalating, and that's again with MFA and strong IAM. And if nearly two-thirds of organizations have already invested in IAM and still report identity-related breaches, why is this? And that's because current tooling wasn't built to detect post-authentication abuse. Identity is the new perimeter. And this is what I'm seeing in the field as we're talking about the problems around identity. I talk to CISOs and security directors and IAM individuals every day. And what we hear is that visibility is a massive problem. They have a bunch of SaaS applications that aren't federated. They're provisioned with uh, just local credentials, and we have no visibility into that. We've got old, outdated on-prem systems that we have no visibility into the logins. It's just a massive problem. And then even if we did have a good governance IGA in place, uh, that's a huge lift up front. And past that, it's a huge lift to maintain. And what you see is that you've got movers, leavers, joiners. People are being hired, people are leaving the organization, people are being added to new projects, and your permission set doesn't match that drift in your risk. And then past that, what people are consistently doing is saying, well, we need to use least privilege analysis. And so you and I have probably all seen the email, or it used to be an old sheet of paper that would go around, and you would see, here are the permissions that you have today. What do you still need? And most people, circle, I need all the same permissions because they don't want to have to ask for access to another system somewhere down the road that they might need. And because of that process, and then because the tools aren't there, we see that about 50% of identities are over provisioned. They're using permission. They have permissions that they're not using, and because of that, breaches happen. And I want to reiterate that this isn't a skill gap. That we've got some very skilled people in the industry. There's a lot of good tools out there, but it's a visibility gap. And this is kind of the state of the market. You've probably seen half a dozen solutions out there trying to pitch a version of identity security. But what's really happening under the hood is that there's fragmentation in the industry. It hasn't consolidated yet. You'll see, one solution will handle IDP really well, and the IDP players will be really interested in securing their brand of identities, right? And I see that most orgs have multiple IDPs for different use cases. Maybe one for on-prem, one for SaaS, or maybe they just never migrated completely over from one system to another. And one does posture, another tool will claim behavior, another one does detection. And what you see is that all these different tools, they're all talking in different languages, they're all in different systems, and they're not stitching together the full identity landscape that we see out there. And that's a big problem, and that causes gaps. So, for example, I see this all the time in the field is when an attacker jumps from maybe a SaaS breach using a token to an AWS console to on-prem, all of that movement just disappears. There's no continuity between what happened in X system and then how that correlates to Y system. And that's exactly why these breaches are going undetected for 300 days. Everyone's solving a part of the problem. And because of that, no one's solving the problem in its entirety. And I just wanted to kind of level set on who we are and why we're uniquely positioned to solve this identity problem. So we've got co-founders that came from Mandiant and FireEye, and they led some of the most complex large incident responses in the world. Um, Often with no tools that could tell the full story. And this is what they realize is that every major breach started with an identity abuse, and that their existing systems, when they would go in and try to triage these events, had no way to track what was actually happening. And so what they decided to do was take some of the best minds in the identity space, build a platform from the ground up that was specifically designed to detect and respond to identity threats in real time. And that's a hard problem to solve, to be able to do this in real time. No one else is really doing that in the market. And what I want to kind of get you to understand is that we were founded by responders, not by theorists. And what they made is a platform that tackles the identity security problem at its root. So first, what we're going to show, and this is what's kind of come out recently in the platform, is our ability to discover all identities in every environment, whether it be on-prem, in the cloud. And when I say cloud, I mean SaaS applications, cloud infrastructure, human, non-human, AI, the whole gamut of identities that you would find out there. We can holistically discover all of those identities. And that's what I'm hearing a lot in my conversations is organizations just don't have a lay of the land. They don't have a starting point. They say, you know what? I don't have any idea past authentication of what all of my identities are doing. I don't even have an idea of where all of my identities are, right? Because we've got these big, complex, massive organizations and there's silos. And then past that, let's just say I had a map of where everything was. IM teams have their work cut out for them. And I'm going to find all these different kinds of vulnerabilities, all these misconfigurations, all of these problems in posture. And where do I start? How do I tie what I need to do to risk? How do I communicate that to the board? And then past that, you can have perfect security and perfect identity posture. We're talking to mature organizations all the time that are still having problems with identity related incidents. And that's why the ability to defend and the ability to respond, past posture is so important. And that's something that we covered too. And that's kind of what we're the gold standard at. And what underpins all of this, the differentiation in our technology is the universal identity graph. We're going to get into that. I'm going to show you that a little bit more, but that's what makes Permiso different. The graph is this living, breathing view of everything that's going on in the environment from an identity standpoint. Which identities live in which places, how they're behaving in each system in real time, how that correlates with each other, how permissions are changing, how permissions are being added and taken away and being used. And that's really, really hard to do with existing technologies. If you think about our scene, how would I be able to look at blast radius for any given identity in a scene? That would look like a bunch of nested SQL joins. Really, really hard to do. Using a ton of compute that I'm sure the SIEM guys would love you to be running all the time so they can rack up the costs. But existing tools just aren't set up to handle this problem. But I've talked about it long enough. Let's show you what the problem is in product and how we solve it uniquely. So I'm going to stop my share here for a second and then pop up the demo. Speaking of good identity security posture, I've got to log back into Okta because my session timed out. All right, we're in. Let me reshare my screen here. And Evan, can you kind of bring my screen back to the forefront? I'm having some trouble resharing it. There we go.
So right now there we go.
Perfect. All right. We're back in business. All right. So this is the Permiso platform. And I want to kind of show you how we do discovery. And the reason I want to talk about discovery is we're actually running a campaign right now where you can just get the lay of the land for your identity. So we call it the Discover campaign. And it's a way for you to kind of see what's out there, inventory your identities holistically, and then start bubbling that up to risk. So, for example, one of the things that you get out of our campaign is could you tell me your top 10 riskiest identities? That's something that would be surfaced. Could you tell me how many identities in your environment? And something that we do really well is be able to classify those identities. So if you think about it, in your environment, you're going to have human identities, you're going to have machine identities, they call NHIs, you're going to have vendor identities that are logging in and maintaining your systems, and be able to categorize these is actually something that's really, really difficult to do because that's one of the first things if you have a risk-based model that you'd want to do. And we can connect with all of your environments like we had talked about before. And this is one of our demo environments that has probably one of the most integrations. We have many more than this, and start to, for the first time, get a full view of what all these identities are doing. And what makes us different is that to us, some players just do non-human, right? That's just another identity for us. Humans are just another identity for us. And what we just released, and it's actually really cool, is the ability to dig into deeply what's going on in the AI landscape. I talk to CISOs all the time, and they say, you know what? We have to do AI. Projects are getting spun up really, really quickly because we don't want to lose our competitive advantage there. We know that all the other players are doing it. And what happens is these AI identities get over provisioned. They have access to maybe things that they shouldn't. And organizations just want to get some visibility into who's making AI, who's using the AI, where is it being used? And then agentic AI, if you think about it, an agentic AI is still just a standard identity, an account that has authorization to do certain things against certain resources. And we can see all of that behavior now for the first time and kind of light up that blind spot that organizations are trying to wrap their arms around. And being able to look and say, you know what? Here are my AI users, here are my AI builders, and then let's start crafting some policy around current usage in our environment. But again, it's something I just wanted to highlight, something new that we brought into the product and something that we're getting a lot of traction on. But past that, I wanted to highlight the universal identity graph and kind of we talked about it, but I want to show you that because that's what makes us truly different. And I like to bring up what we call um, our main universal identity, Peter Parker. Everyone's seen a Spider-Man movie at some point in their lives, I'm sure. And so you understand, that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and we in our organizations we wear a lot of different masks, right? We've got a ton of different logins. Internally, we've got a couple different IDPs, and to be able to see who is actually responsible for all of the actions in the environment behind the accounts is something that IAM teams and SOC teams just really aren't positioned very well to do. And the universal identity looks something like this. So if we zoom in here, we've got Peter Parker, but Peter Parker has access to a lot of different things in the environment. He's got access to AWS. He's Aquaman in AWS. He's Peter Parker as well in a different part. He's got access to Entra as Spider-Man, GCP, Microsoft 365, the whole gamut. And this graph looks nice and pretty, but it's actually really, really difficult to do at scale. And why would you want a universal identity graph? Well, now for the first time, you're able to see who is logging into your critical applications. What level of risk do they have? If Spider-Man gets popped by the transitive property in blast radius, all these other accounts are now at risk. And when you're having an incident is not the time that you want to have to stitch all of this together across your enterprise. And to pull back the covers a little bit, what the universal identity graph looks like in real time, got to refresh the page there and populate it, is something like this. And so this sort of relationship map is not something that organizations can easily do in their current tooling. It would, again, I mentioned it would be a bunch of SQL joins that are just untenable to do. And what we see is that there's a lot of knock-on use cases for having this level of visibility. So I can look into and I can pivot and look into all the activity and all of the sessions that are associated with this universal identity. And that's really important because this is another thing that makes us different, the ability to sessionize identity behavior into a construct that now we can layer on top of our exposure detections, our signals, and our alerting for when we're hunting bad guys, right? You have to have this discrete unit of behavior, and that's actually really hard to define. Because if you think about it, Okta is going to send you information at a different time interval than Entra and different time intervals than AWS. And to stitch that behavior together across systems in a temporal way is actually very difficult to do. And one of the knock-on use cases is all the time organizations say, you know what, this system went down. What was the last person to interact with that system? What did they do? And to be able to get really granular and find out, where do they log into? What exactly was done across the entire enterprise and kind of had that record of truth, that level of visibility is something that organizations just don't have today. But some of the knock-on use cases are actually really interesting. Now that we've got kind of the lay of the land, I can go into this sub-identity, this Spider-Man identity in Entra, and I can do things like bubbling up all of this activity into risk and say, everything that I know about, not only about the way that this identity is provisioned, not only by the way this identity is logging in, but the way it's behaving, where are risks in my environment? Because that's the language of executives and that's the language of the board. And for this identity, I can go down and say, what risks spiked here relatively recently? What was the cause of that spike based on static score and runtime score? And scrolling down, I can say, what? I have a critical exposure here. Let's investigate what's going on. Why is this posture critical? And to be able to say that I've got a Entra ID admin with text-based multi-factor authentication, that's a big problem. Why? Oh, all the time we see that groups like Scattered Spider will use things like SIM swapping to impersonate another identity. That's something that you'd want to get your arms wrapped around. But to zoom out and say, what does this look like from an organizational standpoint? How do I bubble this up for my entire org? This is what that looks like. And I call it the vulnerability treadmill. I was in the endpoint space for a while, but what you do is you go out and you do your scan, whether it be an endpoint or an identity, and what you get back is all this laundry list of things that need to be fixed. And as we know, you have finite resources and finite hours on your teams to work on these sorts of things. How do I know that I'm tackling the things that reduce risk in the best way? And that's what Permiso does for you. And the only way that you can get this prioritized, the kind of the view of here are the vulnerabilities, here are the configurations that I need to change, is if you have both the static and the runtime view of all identity behavior. And if you look at what the things that we surface are actually really interesting, because what does an organization want to do? They want to get the biggest bang for their buck and say, I don't want to impact my environment. So what can I do that's easy that reduces risk in a big way? Just reducing the attack surface, getting rid of stale non-human accounts. They haven't been used in a year. Why do we have them around anymore? Right? Now we know for the first time who created them, who would have been using them. Inactive cloud identities, right? And to just bubble this up and say, here's my hit list of things that are going to reduce risk in the best way. That's something that organizations really don't have today because there's no tool that surfaces this kind of information for them. And then past that, if you look at it, and you're going to see more and more of this in the product, being able to dig into something like AI. How can AI be misconfigured? Where is it overly permissive? You can look in the news in the last 2 weeks, and you're seeing a plethora of AI exploits because that's a part of the, being the identity perimeter. And I want to kind of pivot back though to our Spider-Man Peter Parker example, because this is where we change from truly being, the discovery and posture only to a true platform in that identity threat detection and response. So I can pivot here and say, associated with this exposure are some alerts. So now we're moving past configuration to behavior. And I can, scroll through the laundry list of alerts. But what I see is that I've got a critical 9 alert here. And what does that look like? And so as I do my investigations, I'm showing you what's called a multi-plane alert. We've all been in the industry for like a really long time. We know that alert fatigue is a big problem, is that you're piping a ton of alerts to your SOC team, and they're trying to triage them all. They're trying to separate the signal from the noise. Some of these systems are really, really noisy. And so how do I ensure that Permiso isn't just another tool that's generating a lot of noise and creating a lot of work for my team? And that's where a multi-plane alert comes in. It's an alert of an alert. And I'm going to dig into what that means. But it tells you when there's an actual incident happening in real time. And this is something that you actually have to triage based on everything we know, that universal identity map of the environment. And if I scroll down here, I can look at all these sessions, all that activity, all these events that we were gathering, that we were piping in across the environment. And I bubble that up into alerts, right? So this behavior now is looking suspicious. But if we look at all these individual behaviors, and by the way, this is from a real compromise. So this isn't theoretical. This is data from a real compromise. We can see that a lot of what contributed to this real incident was low-level identity stuff that, number A, probably wasn't being captured by current systems, right? And B, even if it was, probably would have gotten triaged out on an individual basis because the correlation was not being done, and it could not be done at scale because we just don't have resources to do that. And so, for example, a GCP storage having identity and access management changes, not hair on fire. A GCP storage bucket being created, again, nothing crazy. But when we start mapping all of this together, it starts telling a different story. It starts telling the story that that text-based authentication that was weak, that was a critical exposure, well, that was the initial area of compromise for this real world event. And once the attackers were able to get in, they were able to pivot, right? And having that baseline of user behavior, super important because now I can detect access anomalies. And we can trace this compromise past Entra into Microsoft 365 and say, you know what are they looking for? They're looking for where can I pivot into other systems, and to say, you know what, we found some AWS credentials in Microsoft 365, and then now we're going to pivot, and we're going to keep pivoting until we've compromised the entire environment, ultimately getting to GCP. And so that's why it's so important to have a system that can correlate both posture and behavior, do that in real time, which is really, really, really hard to do, and then correlate that across systems to separate the signal from the noise. And so now we've got a really good view of accounts and sessions and tokens that need to be killed and rotated to triage this event. And we can associate this with a known threat actor. And that's something that I really, really want to dig into, is that our FireEye Mandiant heritage is important because we have a ton of threat researchers on our end that are building new identity detections, new identity signals that are enriching the platform every day. And so the reason that we can create these multi-plane alerts, these alerts of alerts that trigger only when the behavior matches a threat actor that we're tracking. And that's important because now your team doesn't have to become an overnight identity expert. You don't have to spend the cycles to have a team that's just out there looking for, net new. Let us do that for you. Let us protect that environment for you. And then we'll surface all of that bad behavior because that's where our heritage is and that's where our expertise is in. And to kind of zoom out, because I know that we covered a lot here, other knock-on use cases that we have in relation to this full view of visibility are like an identity dossier. So past the discover, past the protect, past the defend, we can enrich other systems. You probably have IGA systems in place, right? Being able to do an audit of those systems and say when I'm onboarding somebody or I'm offboarding somebody, what has my director that I'm offboarding, what systems did he or she have access to? How are they using those permissions? What was the activity? And should I give all of those permissions and all of that access to my new director that I have coming in? That's something that we can help with. All the time, we're being pulled into NHI conversations because NHIs are vulnerable. Why? One, there's unclear, who is responsible for securing NHIs. Is it the developer? Is it the SOC team? Is it the IAM team? Unclear responsibilities. Past that, even if we do have a consensus on who is responsible for securing these identities, it's really difficult. For traditional identities, you can layer on really strong multi-factor authentication and call it a day. For NHIs, you can't because there's no human there to authenticate. And so you really have to get a good posture and a good visibility on what these are doing. I don't know many organizations out there that are able to, if I ask them, how long would it take for you to understand that one of your tokens has been compromised? Are you doing behavioral baselines on your NHIs? These are all questions that are really difficult for us with current processes and current tools to wrap our arms around. And the NHI players will say, let us take care of it. But the problem with that is that there's a fuzzy boundary between what is an NHI and what isn't. I haven't always been on the vendor side. I used to, work as a customer, and all the time we would see service accounts that were being logged into by multiple developers. How would I even see that kind of behavior? How would I attribute that to multiple developers? Is that an NHI or isn't it? These are all interesting questions, and that's why you need a holistic identity platform that covers all of those gaps. And now I can, dig in here and get a really granular view from everything that's happening from a posture standpoint and a real-time visibility standpoint into everything that's happening with this NHI, for example. And so what I want to highlight is that we are a true platform because once you have that visibility, once you have the ability to go and start doing things proactively to secure the environment, and once you have the ability to react to anything that happens in the environment, there's all these different use cases that bubble up from that we can handle as well. So that's kind of where I wanted to leave it at, Evan. Do we have any questions in the chat?
Thanks, Austin. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. If anybody has any, feel free to type them in there. We'll give it a couple minutes here. No, I really appreciate you running through this, Austin. I know, like you said, you talk to folks every day and have questions pop up every day. Oh, here's a good one coming up. So what constitutes an exposure for us?
Well, so if you think about the way that we get data, and this is, I'm glad you asked because this is really interesting. We started in a different part than the rest of the industry started on identity visibility. So because we had to see all of the behavior, all of the activity that was going on in the environment, because that's what you need to do when you're trying to do threat detection and response, we had to ingest a lot more data. If I go into this activity, right, and I can look at these retained sessions, we ingest runtime data. And that runtime data, there's a lot more of it than there is posture data. Where are we getting posture data from? Typically, there's going to be an API route for any given system where I can pull in the configurations. And so posture is really important. But the thing is that everyone has access to those same API routes. And so it's almost becoming a commodity. But if you also think about the amount of data it takes for posture, where you know what API routes you have to hit to get the there versus when you're trying to analyze everything from a detection standpoint, we did the hard part up first. And so the long story short is we're typically pulling in through an API or a webhook, standard configurations that you would find in the cloud, whether it be a SaaS application, a cloud infrastructure, and an IDP, and we're looking at it that way. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we just got another one in here. So is the play to replace the existing IAM solutions like IAM, IGA, PAM, et cetera, or leverage those as inputs to provide the IAM posture of the organization?
Yeah. So it's a push and a pull. So I'm not going to go in there and say you've got to rip out everything um, in your current environment, and that we're the panacea for all things. But I'll say that you'd have to evaluate what your current stack is and see what makes sense. Um, Something that differentiates the posture that we bring in versus another player, and maybe your organization would find a lot of value in that, is that because we started an incident response, we built out our postures backwards. And what I mean by that is after we took care of all these incidents, you do an analysis and you say, what could we have done proactively to ensure that this didn't happen? What could have been configured properly? What could we have adjusted? And then all of that intelligence, then we built our way backwards into the platform and said, you know what? These are things that attackers are exploiting. These are things that you actually have to change to become better, so that you don't get popped. And so I would say it's a case by case basis. Sometimes we can work together. Like for example, I know that a lot of IGA tools, we don't do IGA, but we can support them through our strong visibility, right? Maybe there's some overlap in posture there. But something that makes us truly different is that we just don't do that. You get the add-on of the response side of things. And that's where it becomes really, really powerful. So sometimes it's going to be a replace, and sometimes it's going to be a better together story. It just really depends about on the tool stack that you have in the environment. All
Awesome.
right.